Grandma lets 4 boys enter backyard daily, Kat tells neighbor to film it. She just received the news that she would have to appear in court. Overwhelmed, she sat on her living room chair, desperately trying to think of a solution. Suddenly, she heard a loud bang. She looked out the window and saw those 4 boys again. Her heart pounded as they strode up to her door. Gary Suttle, a 75-year-old Texan woman, was living out her retirement on her land as peacefully as she could. She had purchased a whopping 2-acre property back in the day. It was a beautiful piece of land, but with age comes a lot of setbacks. She wasn't as active as she once was, and struggled to maintain her property. People began to notice. Gary lived in Riesel, Texas completely by herself. When she first bought her property, she saw her dream house, but now, she saw nothing but hassle. With all of her family living out of state, and her late husband gone for several years now, Gary had no one around her. She was an easy target to be taken advantage of. As the years passed, the lawn that Gary used to love to look out on became a source of fear and anxiety. Now, it was a vast, eerie-looking space with overgrown bushes and trees. Anyone and anything could have been hiding in there and she wouldn't have a clue. With so much space around her, there was bound to be trouble. When Gary first heard the strange noise coming from her backyard, she tried to ignore it, hoping it was just a badger or fox passing through. But when the noise continued and she began to distinguish the sound of voices, fear gripped her body. She sat frozen in her living room, unsure of what to do. When she eventually garnered up the courage to peek out the window, her heart pounded. Behind the bushes, she saw 4 young boys. She couldn't see what they were doing, but she knew that whatever it was, it mustn't have been good. They were blatantly trespassing on her property. Gary was too scared to confront them, and she didn't want to get the cops involved. The cops were the last people she wanted to deal with. Recently, Gary had a run-in with the cops. Out of nowhere, she received an official notice that ordered her to go to court as she was in breach of property laws. They wanted her to cough up a big fine for not cutting her grass. Texas was one of the few states that made it illegal to let your grass grow above 18 inches. If you do, you get fined, but there was a problem. Gary had no idea this law existed and never received the initial notice and fine. The first time they contacted her, they reprimanded her for avoiding the fine and ordered her to appear in court. They knew her age and circumstance and still threatened her with jail time over her violation. Riesel Police Chief Danny Crumnow said that Gary let the grass grow too high and that this was a violation of the city ordinance. When the police showed up on her doorstep and told her crimes were serious, she was bewildered. She'd been trying to avoid them ever since. She was running out of options, so she decided to do something that caught the attention of her neighbor. Gary continued to let the boys trespass on her property. As long as they didn't go near her house, she didn't care, but not everybody felt the same way. Jerry's neighbor, Tom, was a quiet man who tried to look out for Gary whenever he could. But being an old man himself, he wasn't always able to be of much help, until now. Unbeknownst to Gary, Tom noticed the boys creeping in and out of Jerry's backyard and immediately began to worry for her safety. They were young but secretive, constantly carrying bags in and out of her yard. He had enough. He grabbed his outdoor security camera and set it up overlooking Jerry's backyard. What he found was beyond imagination. While Gary sat in her living room, pretending to be oblivious to the commotion in her backyard, Tom was hot on their case. He turned on his screen and fixated on the live action. They were completely clueless that someone was watching them. Tom's jaw dropped as he realized what they took out of their bags. The boys had brought gardening tools. Every day, the young boys worked on Jerry's yard piece by piece. Gary had no idea that word of her possible arrest spread throughout the neighborhood like wildfire. It sparked horror and shock in everyone who heard the news. How could they possibly arrest an old woman over tall grass? The boys wanted to do more. When Gary failed to appear in court, a warrant was issued for her arrest. She pondered her options. Gary was too old and weak to do the work herself and had little money to pay someone else to do it. Tom couldn't believe his eyes. At the edge of Jerry's expansive land, Tom could see 4 boys coming toward her house, already inside her yard. He grew nervous and watched as they knocked on Jerry's door. When Gary answered the door, Tom could see her nervous expression as she braced herself for what they had to say. The boys were young, very young in fact. The oldest could have been maybe 15. Still, Gary felt uneasy, knowing these boys had been trespassing on her property for days. They started looking around her yard, and that's when she saw them clearly. These boys had mud and dirt all over their clothes. Two of the boys said hi and disappeared while the other two stayed back. The boys who stayed were holding garden tools, a weed whacker, shears, and some other things. Gary was frozen. What on earth were these boys doing? But then she saw the other two boys come around the corner. One of them was pushing a lawnmower. Shortly after, the boys began to mow the lawn after explaining that they had already ripped away all of the overgrown weeds. Gary couldn't believe what she was witnessing. The boys' effort sent tears down her face. She has lived there for 59 years and was left speechless after seeing the good deed and was grateful for their help. The four boys who are brothers told the news why they wanted to help her. It's a summer day, we don't have season passes yet to Warren Falls. What else could we do? Just go out and help some people. These young boys' efforts were far more than just cutting grass. They didn't know they had saved Gary from prison time. She's 75 years old, and she needs some help mowing, said Blaine Reynolds, one of the boys. That's the least we could do. Another brother, Brandon Reynolds, also added, I really wouldn't want her coming out here and doing it or paying someone else when we could have just done it for free. As the sun shone brightly that day, neighbors couldn't help but witness these incredible boys' actions. Gary ran over to the boys and gave them cold drinks, but then out of the corner of her eye, she spotted 5 more men coming towards her yard, one of which was Tom. As they began getting closer, she could tell that the neighbors who were approaching her also had gardening tools on them. The neighbors had huddled together and come up with a plan. Half of the team would take one side of the yard and the other half, the other side. The neighbors of Gary Sutter also pitched in with the 4 boys. They brought their lawnmowers and started going to work without any dispute. Even in 90-degree weather, the Reynolds brothers and neighbors of the elderly woman came together to help her out. Gary looked out onto her lawn and could not believe what was happening. A whole community was coming together for her. I cannot believe this. I'm very seldom without words. But this is one time, you mark it down in history, that I didn't have something to say, Gary said. She was wholly shocked that all the work had been done in under 2 hours. She couldn't believe what the young boys and the community had done, and it left her completely speechless. When the boys finally heard about the court warrant for Gary, they couldn't contain themselves. I'd do it for her a second time, or a third time, Blaine Reynolds said. Anything to keep that lady from having to go to court. What an incredible act of human virtue and kindness, and all coming from boys of such a young age. After the grass had been cut down and the yard was all cleaned up, Gary was told she needed to go to court and sign documents indicating that she never received the original notice to appear in court. She wanted to get the charges dropped. It is very heartbreaking to see that someone that I didn't even know came out and spent 2 hours in the sun doing what we thought the city wanted to be done, and then they turn around and say, no, Gary said. Their decision angered the entire community and they were ready to fight. The city still stood by Jerry's violation. They wanted this poor woman to appear in court because of her infraction. But her community couldn't let that happen. KWTX News went to Facebook and other media to cover this incredible story and show how when a community comes together anything is possible. Gary didn't have to go to court, and her warrant has been dismissed. All thanks to these 4 incredible boys.